We have a jam-packed schedule today, so I'll just go ahead and get things started. Welcome everyone to our third webinar with International Oak Society and Global Conservation Consortium for Oak. As always, please stay muted throughout the presentations, and there will be time for question and answers following each presentation. We have two presentations in store for you today. Myself, Kate Good, and Karina Orozco from the Morton Arboretum will be presenting on our work within our Global Tree Conservation Program, and Michael Eason from San Antonio Botanical Garden will be talking more about the oak collections at the Botanical Garden. But I will pass it off to Roderick, who will go through some announcements.
Hi, everybody. Great to see another well-attended webinar. Welcome. A couple of thank yous. First of all, to GCCO for co-hosting this, and to the Morton Arboretum for providing the Zoom services, and also to hold the recording of the webinar. Got some news to share. The IOS board, on recommendation of the Development and Outreach Committee, has created a new membership type that offers institutions the opportunity to support the IOS at a higher level. As you know, support from all membership levels helps fund our Oak Conservation and Research Fund, and also the production of our journal with International Oaks. That's our the main item on our budget every year. And this is especially true for these institutions. So we already have 4 institutions that have joined at this level, and I'd like, therefore, to take the opportunity to thank our supporting institutional members at Denver Botanic Gardens and the Morton Arboretum, and our standard institutional members, San Antonio Botanical Garden and Bartlett Tree Experts. And we hope we'll be able to welcome other institutions willing to join the IOS at this level. On other news, we have a great program of tours and events planned for this year. For the summer, we have open day events in the UK and France. And in the fall, we have tours in California, in the Carolinas, and also in Taiwan. So spread across the globe, and should be opportunities for anyone who wishes to join those. And you'll find more information on our events page on the website, especially in the next week or so. There'll be more details published there. And finally, a reminder that the board is receiving nominations for the IOS Service Awards. These are presented at each conference every 3 years to individuals who have made long-term efforts supporting the work with genus Quercus, or for the advancement of the goals of the IOS. So if you know anyone who you think deserves these awards, please let the board know. You'll find instructions to do this in the next newsletter, which should go out tomorrow. That's all I had from me. So back to you, Emmy, and thanks very much.
All right, thanks so much, Roderick. And yeah, thanks so much for allowing us to present today. I am joined, I'm Amy Byrne, a Global Tree Conservation Manager at the Morton Arboretum, and I'm joined with my colleagues Kate Good, Research Assistant and Red List Officer, and Karina Orozco, Tree Conservation Coordinator at the Arboretum, and we're just going to give you a summary of the global tree conservation work that we do at the Arboretum. So just a quick outline, I'll just give kind of a summary of, why tree conservation, why is it important, an introduction to our global tree conservation program, and then Kate will go into the conservation gap analysis methodology. I will provide a brief summary of the consortium for oak, and Karina will talk more about our methodology to track oak conservation collections, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So why tree conservation? Well, you may have seen from the State of the World's Trees report that came out in September 2021, they found that there are around 17,500 threatened tree species in the world, and that's more than double of the threatened amphibian, bird, reptile, and mammal species. So there's quite a large number of threatened trees globally. As you may know, the threats to trees globally are a number of things such as agriculture, harvesting, pest diseases, and of course, climate change. And so what are we doing as Arboretum and Botanic Gardens to address this global tree threat problem? So Arboreta are in a unique position to support tree conservation. Arboreta have the capacity to host living collections, conduct ex-situ conservation, be a part of on-the-ground in-situ conservation work, conduct plant science, horticulture and breeding, as well as serve as public outreach and education. So that's what we're doing through our Global Tree Conservation Program. We were established in 2014, and ultimately our mission is safeguarding tree species through global collaboration. So as a team, we are working to address the threat to trees globally. And we do it through the Global Conservation Consortium for oak, but also we recently launched the Center for Species Survival Trees in partnership with IUCN Species Survival Commission. And as the Center for Species Survival, we conduct projects following the IUCN SSC approach, which is assess, plan, and act. And we are going to go through some examples of the work that we're doing that follow this model. So again, just a very brief summary and overview of our program, just so that we have enough time to go into the details of our projects. So I'm going to pass it off to Kate now, who's going to talk more about the assess portion of our work.
Thanks, Amy. So like Amy mentioned, my name's Kate Good. I'm in the Global Tree Conservation Program, and I primarily work with assessments in the GTCP at Morton. So that is mainly through red list assessments, but it's also through something called conservation gap analyses. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of our preliminary results for the gap analysis we're working right now on Mesoamerican oaks. So Amy, if you want to move to the next slide. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, a conservation gap analysis is an evaluation of the in situ, so the wild, and ex situ or in collections, conservation needs and successes of a species or a genus. It's a way for us to identify what we don't know and what we do know about a species and how we can bridge that gap, and also to identify priorities for conservation. So Mesoamerica, you can see the map of what we're defining Mesoamerica up on the right, Mexico and Central America. It's a global center for oak biodiversity. There are more threatened oaks in Mexico than anywhere in the world. But for many species, little is known regarding the full distribution of the species, the threats they face, or their current status. So Mesoamerica is an ideal area for a conservation gap analysis. Next, Amy. So just really briefly to discuss some of the methods of a gap analysis. So we first identified our target taxa, and for this analysis, we focused on oaks that were assessed as threatened or data deficient on the red list. So that was 59 species of oaks in Mexico and Central America. Between 2017 and 2022, once per year, we distributed ex-situ collection surveys to institutions we targeted on plant search that reported having collections of Mesoamerican or US oaks, also through the GCCO members and our professional networks. We gathered and cleaned in situ data from a variety of sources, so publicly available databases like GBIF, Canabio, Tropicos, regional herbaria, literature review, and conversations with experts. And then we went through a thorough review process to clean up that data set. I traveled to Mexico and worked with our partners, Alan Combs and Susana Valencia, and we reviewed all of the occurrence maps point by point. We also had a workshop in Baja California where we reviewed the occurrence maps for the cross-border species, those that are in California and in Baja California. And our final data set consists of just over 4,400 occurrence points for those 59 species. For all the species, we generated maps. I'll show you examples of some of the maps, and we performed analyses to prioritize species for conservation action. We worked with regional species experts to create an in-depth profile for each species. And we wanted to make sure that each species has an expert from the region in which the species is found to write these profiles. So yeah, thank you. So just some of the high-level results to share with you guys today. So 197 institutions from 27 countries responded to our ex-situ surveys over those 6 years, saying that they do have Mesoamerican oaks in their collection. But a vast majority of those institutions that have Mesoamerican species of oaks are in the United States and Europe, as you can see from this graph. Very few are actually in Mesoamerica. In fact, only 5% of our respondent institutions are from Mesoamerica that said they have Mesoamerican oaks in their collections. The most common species of Mesoamerican oaks in ex-situ collections are Quercus acutifolia and Quercus engelmannii, which are each found in over 30 collections, again, mainly in the United States and Europe. You can see the orange bar is those that are represented in Mesoamerica. If you go to the next slide, Amy, this is the same graph, it's just a different y-axis. So now these are species that are found in fewer ex-situ collections. But the main point from this bar graph is that there are 22 species, which are circled there in the graph, that are not found in any ex-situ collections anywhere in the world. So these should really be targeted for adding to our collections. And the next slide. So for each species, we generated maps to look more in depth at this in situ and ex situ conservation needs. So these are 2 example maps for Quercus delgodoana. This is an endangered species of oak endemic to the Sierra Madre Oriental in Mexico. And I'll just describe each of these maps briefly because there's a lot going on here. So the map on the right is a map of the delgodoana occurrence points in purple. Around each occurrence point, we added a 20-kilometer buffer to represent the species' inferred native range. This is standard methodology in gap analyses in the absence of species distribution modeling. My coworker Bella is working on distribution modeling. Amy, do you see the map? Someone commented that they're not seeing the screen. I just want to make sure that people can see the screen.
I can see them. Can Roderick or others see them?
Yeah, I can see them. It may depend on how, Philippe, how you're managing your screen. But we do.
I'm one slide behind. That's all. I'm still seeing the Mesoamerican oak species, and it came.
Well, that's interesting. Maybe if you go back and go forward, Amy, really quick.
Yeah.
I will continue talking about the maps. Yeah, so we placed
Okay, thank you. I've got the maps. They are there. Okay. Thank you.
So the blue circle is just a 20-kilometer buffer around the each occurrence points. And the map on the right shows protected areas. So the darker green protected areas are outside of the species native range, and the lighter green protected areas are within the species range. So for Quercus delgodoana, about 7% of its native range is covered in protected areas. And then we can also look at the number of actual occurrence points that are found within protected areas. So that's one way that we can look at how our needs for in situ conservation, if a species needs more protected areas, or if a large percentage of their range is covered. The map on the left, the colored regions are Holdridge life zones. So Holdridge life zones are ways to classify land area based on precipitation, biotemperature, evapotranspiration ratio, and elevation. And it was originally described for use in the tropics. And we find that it's really well suited for oaks, specifically in Mexico and Central America. As you can see, Quercus delgodoana, our occurrence points, those little white points, really fall right along the Holdridge life zone that's represented in yellow. That's the warm, temperate, moist forest. So that's the life zone that they prefer, and that's the most commonly found. The dark black triangles on that map, so on the very top of the map and the bottom, those are areas that we have collected from and that are represented in ex situ collections somewhere in the world. So we have collected from the farthermost portion of that species range and the southernmost portion of that species range. And this map suggests that the center of the species range for Quercus delgodoana could be a target for ex situ collections. It's also a way to identify life zones that aren't represented in ex situ collections. So in this instance, for example, the blue life zone is not represented in our ex situ collections. In the absence of genetic data, this is one way that we can prioritize try to increase our genetic diversity of our populations by trying to make sure we have the greatest geographic and ecological breadth of our populations and collections. So that's just a really brief overview about the type of analysis and the type of maps you'll see in this report. The report will be published hopefully late this spring, May or June, in both Spanish and English. It'll be available on our Morton website, and we'll hopefully distribute it widely. Thank you to anyone here who has shared ex-situ data with us. We're also currently working on a gap analysis of Southeast Asian oaks that'll hopefully be published next year, which is also another really important region for oaks. If anyone on this call has oaks from Southeast or Eastern Asia in their collections or know of collections that have those species of oaks, we would really appreciate learning from you and getting some of that data if you're able to share it with us. Also, I'm always looking for photos of these species of oaks to include in the gap analysis. If you have any photos of threatened Mesoamerican species or of their habitat and would be willing to share, we would love to include those in our report. And Amy, in the last slide, will share the email address that you guys can send them to. That's it for me. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kate. All right, so now moving on to, you'll recall from that image that I shared a little bit ago with the Assess, Plan, Act model, I'm going to go into a bit more detail on kind of the Plan, Act portion. Again, just a very high-level summary, just an introduction to the Global Conservation Consortium for Oak, or GCCO, which I think many of you are aware of and know of. But essentially, the GCCO takes the information that Kate and others do in that assess portion of our conservation model. So from gap analyses and from red list assessments, the GCCO takes that information and utilizes it for the work that it's doing. So the GCCO is essentially part of the broader Global Conservation Consortium network, which are spearheaded by BGCI and then led by institutions such as the Morton Arboretum, leading the Consortium for Oak. And the consortia essentially are following scaling up tree conservation globally, because as you recall from the State of the World's Trees report, which I shared with you earlier, there is obviously a large global threat to trees, and that needs to be addressed. And these consortia are utilizing specialist knowledge of target taxa. They're conserving trees where the need is greatest, so in the diversity centers for those taxa, and largely are focused on in situ and ex situ work focused in the centers of diversity, and like I said, led by institutions in the centers of diversity. And ultimately, the mission of the consortia are to mobilize a coordinated network of institutions and experts to collaboratively develop and implement comprehensive conservation strategies for priority threatened plant groups. These are the consortia. There are more that have been formed since then, so I do need an updated slide. But these are the consortia plus more that have formed. And for oak specifically, this is just, I just wanted to show this heat map. This is from the Red List of Oaks 2020 report. And this is just to show you the threatened species of oaks globally. So the darker the red pinkish color, the higher number of threatened oaks that are there. So you'll see that in China and Southeast Asia, Mexico and Central America, and the US have a large number of threatened oaks. And these are mainly the regions that the Consortium for Oak are working in at the moment to address these threats to oaks. And one way that we do that is, like I said, is through ex situ conservation. So I'll just briefly touch on what ex situ conservation, what we're doing that through the consortia, and then Karina will talk in more detail about some great case studies that we have executed for ex situ conservation. So why the importance of conserving threatened plants and ex situ collections? Well, as probably all of you know, oaks, their acorns cannot be seed banked. So an alternative to conserving oaks long-term outside of cryopreservation are living collections. And so living collections serve as great opportunities for research, breeding, utilizing that seed for restoration projects, as well as education opportunities. But through the consortia, we want to make sure we are conserving these oaks and collections in a strategic way. So we're following the findings from this publication toward the Metacollection. You can find this publication on BGCI's website. And essentially, they outlined this importance of a metacollection model. So combined holdings of a group of collections that are stewarded by separate institutions. And they recommend, that no one garden or collection can or should hold all the plants for a specific species. So a coordinated meta-collection model is needed. So that's working across institutions to host plants for a species for long-term conservation and ensuring that we are capturing that wild genetic diversity. It's replicated across sites, so that, we're not putting all our eggs in one basket for a species, so that it's at various sites and it's protected there long-term. So I just wanted to briefly introduce that, what we're doing within the GCCO ex-situ wise, and this meta collection model that we are following within the consortium, and that we are working with partners to steward these meta collection sites, which Karina will provide a few more examples of these sites and some case study sites and what we're doing to hopefully track more data from these meta collection sites long term. So Karina?
Thanks, Amy. My name is Karina Orozco. As Amy said, I'm the research coordinator in the Global Tree Conservation Program here at the Morton Arboretum, and I will just be highlighting a few of our established meta collection sites with the U.S. Forest Service and other partners in the U.S. Southeast. Okay, so this is one example, a meta collection site at Beach Creek in North Carolina, USA. We coordinated a partnership between Donald E. Davis Arboretum in Auburn, Alabama, and a Region 8 U.S. Forest Service geneticist, Marcus Borwell, to work together and establish the site for Quercus boyntonii and Quercus georgiana, which are two species of conservation concern. And this is also falling under the U.S. Forest Service Genetic Resource Management Area designation. So these all have the underlying purpose of conserving different species, but they can be used with our partners for different purposes. So in this case, we can get seed from these species in the conservation grove for restoration, and it also provides us with insight into the species' climate resilience over time. Next slide. Thank you. Here we have a conservation grove of Quercus austrina at the Francis Marion National Forest, and we worked again with Marcus and also our partners Ron Lance, an expert botanist of the North American Land Trust, and also Adam Black of Bartlett Arboretum to establish this site. Next slide. And then finally, this last example is the result of a partnership between the city of Columbia, Missouri, as well as the Stevens Lake Park Arboretum. And we worked with partners Ryan Russell and Mark Coggeshall with guidance from the tree conservation biologist here at the Arboretum, Sean Hoban. And they actually established 5 meta collection sites of Quercus acerifolia here around city parks. So an important aspect of this project that I have been working on with partners and with my coworkers here at the Arboretum is to develop a methodology for tracking the data collected at these sites over time. So we began thinking more about the process last year as we realized that any data collected on these different species survival, growth, phenology, etc. over time would need to be stored in a consistent way across institutions so that it can be easily pulled for data analysis and tracking in the future. And after talking with our partners and other GIS users, we found that the easiest way to do this was to develop a survey 1-2-3 form with pre-made fields to collect all kinds of data on individuals in the conservation groves. So just some examples of that would be the data collector who is taking the data, the date that it's being collected, the tree's ID number, its health rating, stem diameter, and other metrics of growth. And this would all be done with a tablet or a phone in the field. And then the data could be downloaded via an Excel sheet and eventually uploaded to BGCI's plant search tool, specifically in the pedigree module, which similarly harbors global data at the individual plant level. And if you have any questions about that tool, I can put you in contact with Abby Meyer at BGCI, who oversees it. But next slide. Thank you. An example of what we can then do with the data is this GIS dashboard, which will hopefully soon be published on the Morton Arboretum website. But our kind of resident GIS specialist, Angelica Avalos, helped us to create this. And it's supposed to be an easy way for us, as well as the general public, to visualize and track the data for these sites. So you can see a map in the middle with points on it representing these individual metacollection sites for oak conservation, as well as just some statistics on the sides that are helpful. So on the right, upper right, you can see kind of a breakdown of the IUCN conservation status of these different species. And underneath that, you can kind of see the mortality rate in total, which will also change if you zoom in on the map, depending on which individuals are in your field of vision. And then on the left, you can just see the total number of oaks planted in a certain area, as well as the number of tree species that we planted per year. So if you have something that resembles a metacollection site, or if you also have maybe a location and a species in mind to develop one of these, please reach out to us so that we can talk more. Thank you. That was my part.
Great. Thank you so much, Karina. And yeah, once this dashboard is finalized, of course, we'll share it out via, GCCO newsletters and other emails and ways that you all can access this. But yeah, like Karina said, if you have any questions or ideas for metacollection sites or developing a metacollection site or already have one that you're stewarding at your institution, such as if you're already a species steward within the GCCO, please contact us and we can make sure that we can work together to track data at your site over time. But that's everything we wanted to share with you all today in terms of global tree conservation work at the Arboretum. Of course, we just want to acknowledge the many partners and funders and who are helping to support this work. And of course, here's our contact information. If you have any questions, like Kate said earlier, if you have any data that you'd be willing to share for the Southeast Asia or East Asia gap analysis, please contact her, and/or any photos for the Mesoamerica or the Southeast Asia gap analysis, the photos of the species or its habitat. Of course, we will be able to provide photo credit or things like that. So please be in touch. But right now, we're happy to take questions. And thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you to the International Oak Society and Roderick. Stop sharing.
Thank you, Amy. There's a couple of questions in the chat. Do you see that?
Yes. I think the first question, is that the one with the barriers to using field maps versus Survey 123? Do Kate or Karina want to answer this?
Yeah, so not all of our, oops, sorry, Karina are in the same room. Not all of our partners have a GIS account. And so field maps are awesome, and we definitely explored using those as well. And we may still use them in the future because we're more interested in that data itself and less the map, because we know where all these individuals are planted. It's part of a conservation grove. We have the coordinates. We were told that Survey 123 is more user-friendly for when you're interested in specifically data collection, and field maps is better for when you're interested in generating good maps and maybe searching for an individual doing a survey. But if you have more experience or an opinion on field maps versus Survey 123, I'd be interested in hearing that, because we're still learning as well.
Great. Thanks, Kate. And thanks for that question. And I see another one in the chat about having science-based data on genetic diversity of the threatened species to help you represent preferred number of species and capture maximum genetic diversity in ex-situ collections. Karina and Kate, please jump in if you would like, but like Karina mentioned, with that Acerifolia metacollection planting site, Sean Hoban, our tree conservation biologist, and his team at the Arboretum have been, spearheading a lot of efforts with population genetic work, and provided and produced many publications kind of on this question about, how many individuals should you be sampling within a population to ensure you are capturing that maximum genetic diversity across the species range. And so we've utilized information from those publications and recommendations that Sean and his team have provided. And with the acerifolia case, Sean and his team have done, specific genetic analyses to provide more details to Ryan Russell and those who developed the meta-collection site, so they know which individuals, from which populations, or how many and more individuals from which populations they should sample to increase, that rare allele capture, and to ultimately increase the genetic diversity capture than what they already have established at the sites. So yes, we are taking all of that into account, and we are continuously having conversations with Sean and his team and the Conservation Genetics Working Group, a part of the consortia, to see if we can create more guidelines that are just very, high level, but, applicable enough for those who are in the field and doing these collections to follow sound recommendations on, maybe the number of maternal lines or just number of individuals total they should collect from. So I hope that helped answer your question. I don't know if Karina or Kate, you want to add anything more? Any other questions? Feel free to put it in the chat or unmute. All right. Well, I think we're good to pass it along to our next presenter, Roderick, if you're good with that. So yeah, Michael Eason of San Antonio Botanical Garden will be sharing a presentation of their oak collection. So Michael, whenever you're ready. Thanks.
All righty. Thank you. Okay, is everyone seeing
Yep,
first slide?
looks great.
So,
Yep.
yes, again, thanks for inviting me to do this. Hopefully this will be interesting to some folks. So I've been at the garden for about 7 years, but only full-time the past 2. So the vast majority of the work towards the end of the presentation will be the last couple of years. And so we've had some issues, as people may already know this. So let's get started. So the garden itself, if you're not familiar with it, the conception, the idea of having a botanical garden in San Antonio started in the 1940s, and that was a couple of women who sort of devised this plan, and it took about 20 years to get enough funding and develop a master plan and identify a site for the garden, which is an old sort of quarry, sort of just top of this hill that was used for waterworks at one point in the past. It's sort of adjacent to another city park, and then about a block away is Breckenridge Park, which is I think the first park in San Antonio. Groundbreaking started in basically 1976. And when you start to look at some of these old photos, you'll see some of these things it was pretty stark back then. And they officially opened in May of 1980. Let's see if I have my little pointer here and get to this on the screen. And I'm not sure if you can see this. Here. Yeah. So I believe this is a cambii that is still on site. So that's kind of one of the interesting things that we're able to pick out from some historical photos and documents. Paul Cox, he was sort of the initial botanist that was there on site, plantsman, nursery guy. That doesn't mean he was the only one, but he was sort of very active with acquiring plants. He was very active with networking throughout the state of Texas and beyond to bring some interesting specimens there. Down here below, you'll see a couple more photos. This is an East Texas cabin that's bottom right. And the bottom left is a sort of a photo of where the main entrance was going to be at one point. That is no longer there. However, that rock wall in the foreground is. So here's that network of collections I was talking about. Some of these people you might recognize if you're from Texas: Scott Ogden, Martin Warnock, Lowry, Landon Lockett, Will Fleming. That's by no means not all of them. One of the more interesting things I found out when going through our plant ledger is there were a lot more native plant nurseries back in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s than there are now. That was pretty sort of sobering to see how many of these nurseries have closed over the years and just not being replaced. So one of the big issues that we've always had, I'm sure other people do, is gaining access to wild collected material that has provenance. Now, I'll point this out later, but you can shop all day and buy live oaks that actually are coming from, they label them Texas live oaks, but they're actually coming out of Florida. To find a live oak that was collected here in the state of Texas that's either fusiformis or virginiana is really difficult to do. So 2000s to 2020, roughly, there was really no active collecting. This is a photo of the last entry in our ledger, and that would have been January, collection number 18, 2001. And at that point, it stopped. I'm sure maybe there's records somewhere of some of the plants that came in. At the time, the garden was city run, so that's city government. It's changed since then. When I started working, nobody seemed to have a list of any species that were planted in the previous 10 years that I was there. And it was kind of evident as you walk through the garden, you can see that there are plants that really don't make sense in certain areas. Like, for instance, there's a Philadelphus that is an eastern U.S. species, and it might occur in Texas, in deep East Texas, but it's planted in our hill country area. So there are certain things that were planted throughout the garden that really don't make a whole lot of sense. And I don't really know who was doing that, but for a time, again, there was no active collecting. Plants were bought from local nurseries. Plants were grown by the city at their tree yard and just brought in. No provenance, no idea where any of these things came from. At some point, someone did make some sort of hand catalogs that were, or card catalogs that were written out by hand. However, at some point, they were stored in an area that was heavily molded, well, wet, so they became mold infested, and you had issues with insect damage and things like wasp had got in there, and I think even some rodents had made some nests. So a lot of those were thrown away because they weren't readable at all. We do have a handful of them, so we're slowly tracking down some of these plants in the garden. We did have a garden expansion in 2017 that added about 8 acres or so to our footprint. So we're up to about 38 acres, and we're kind of fenced in. The east side is a military base. Then we have sort of residential areas all around the other sides. So here we are. There's an overview of the garden. This is taken in the sort of early 80s, early mid 80s. And this is before the conservatory was established. And the conservatory that we have now, all of our buildings are in this area. So they weren't even on the radar yet to even begin construction. But two places to keep an eye out on for the next slide is the Oak Edom, which is now our water saver community. This is our hill country area, East Texas. Then we have South Texas. And this area over here was originally supposed to be the West Texas Trail, West Texas area, but that kind of got converted a little bit later on. I think they may have run out of funding at that point. Here's a photo, a Google Earth photo from January of last year. So you can see how much it's grown in those 40 years. So it's really quite impressive to see the growth that has happened. But one thing to point out, like a lot of people assume all of these native areas, we quote unquote native, 40 years old max on the plantings. So when people walk through, they have this feeling that these gardens have been there for much longer than they actually have been. One of the things that I've been working on is basically identifying tree species throughout the garden. And the next slide will show you the oaks, getting GPS coordinates. So again, just to be clear, a lot of plants don't have provenance. They don't have accession numbers. They don't have IDs. So there's a huge hill to sort of overcome here. But this is our oak collection. So far, I've been able to identify over 250 specimens throughout the garden. Sadly, that's only about 27 taxa. And out of that 27 taxa, we have 3 species, the Polymorpha, Fusiformis, and Virginiana, that make up 165 of those 250 specimens. That's about 66%. Those are great plants, highly overused. And just to give you an idea, in this area, this is sort of our screenshot of our new garden. So those additional 8 acres, essentially not including the conservatory here, kind of runs this little area is our new 8 acres. Out of that, there are 3 tree species, three oaks found in that area. Virginiana, Polymorpha, and there's like 2 or 3 what appear to be Shumardii. And just to give you an idea, in this area of our parking lot, there are 50 polymorphids. And this row here, all Polymorpha. And I get it, it was part of the garden design, but coming from a botanic garden or someone that likes to see lots of diversity, I think that we missed a golden opportunity there to bring in a large amount of plant diversity into those areas that were planted. So let's try to highlight some of the good things, or at least the new things. So last year sometime I was asked to identify some oaks that this was a garden, an old garden that was being taken out, and we were getting funding to install a new garden. And they asked me to go through and say, hey, which oaks, which trees back there do you think we should save? And the old garden had these sort of facades of houses that kind of blocked all the trees behind them. And it's an area that people don't really walk. So I'd never really been back there. And I was really surprised to come across and see what we have. I think it's around 14 taxa in this one garden. And it's things like Arizonica, Gracilliformis, then we have Polymorpha that was collected, Vasianas were in there. There's some Cambiis, the Marylandicas. So all of these different species were in there. I was like, we need to save all of these. And so we're able to work with the designers. And now we have a trail that actually goes through and you can actually see all of these oaks one by one. And this is by far our sort of the best concentration of diversity of oaks in the garden. We will be augmenting that as we are moving forward. And some of it, we've actually planted 2 more species. We planted a Rhizophylla and another Gravesii that we have acquired in this area. That was like about a month ago, I believe. So from here, once you get out of this area, that diversity kind of drops off. Our East Texas area, we just have a handful of East Texas species found this is our East Texas lake. A lot of plants that were planted back in the day. And I was like, what happened to all of these species as I went through this ledger? And, go out, try to find them. They're not there. There's a few that I was lucky enough to find, like the Mesoamerican. Other ones like the Niagara and some of these other ones are really quite obvious. Although some of them, like the Fellows, I would probably walked under that 50 times before it was pointed out to me. It's just so hidden amongst everything else. But many of the plants that were brought in, and there was a lot more diversity there, they were planted at 12 inches tall or 14 inches. They were really quite small. And I think that they just didn't get the care that they need. And they slowly just died out. And that could have been someone stepping on them. It could have been rodents. It could have been any number of things, lack of watering. And that's kind of true throughout the native areas of the garden. Our Central Texas, our typical Central Texas species that you would have, that's what you would find there. We do have a good assortment of Lacey's and chinkapin oaks that are throughout this area. South Texas, we got crickets. No oaks. But to me, I see that as an opportunity to bring in a handful of these plants, like the Fusiformis from South Texas, provenance plants, laurifolia, et cetera, et cetera. But currently, we do not have any oaks in that region. Our West Texas, Little Mexico, and this was the terms that were used back in the 80s for this area. Currently, this is the rare and endangered garden, and on the upslope on the other side, sort of the left of that gazebo, is what we call our cacti and succulent area. But through here we have things like rhizophylla. I was able to track that one down. That was supplied to us by Lynn Lowry. Polymorpha, I'm not exactly sure where those came from, if they came out of Mexico, if that was a Texas collection. We do have a cambii in there. And just a few months ago, as I'm sort of tromping around these areas kind of off trail, I was able to find a Terminella, a Grisea, and a Gravesii that are somehow surviving amongst the mix of everything else that's growing through there. Originally, there was a Gambellii and a few other species that were planted, but they did not make it. The Hinklei that I have noted here, that one is the only plant in the garden currently, or the only oak in the garden currently, that has provenance to a wild collection. And that was a collection that was made a few years ago out of Shafter, and that was grown out, and it's currently there, and it's our only Hinklei that has provenance. So the formal areas, which take up quite a bit of the garden, so it's just kind of strewn throughout the walkways and everything. We do have a pretty good sampling throughout there. Definitely the highlight would be the Germana and the cambiis that we have kind of strewn throughout. We do have a nice assortment of Hinkleys that are there. I think we have five trees there in the front of the admin building. Very mature trees, 20 feet tall, produce acorns every year, produce suckers every year. They're doing really quite fantastic. I was able to narrow that down through, that was a Barton Warnock collection that was passed along to us. And those most likely, well, they came out of the Shafter area. I'm just not sure if they came from the mine site or the roadside site at this point. So just to recap. So we have up to date 27 species in the garden. Up until about 2 or 3 months ago, that number was 24. I again found a few more sort of hanging out here and there. In the back of house, that's where our big collection is, but that doesn't really count, does it? We have about 58 taxa back there, and it's all over the place. Basically, at this point, we have every Western species of oak found in Texas, aside from Hypoleucoides. So that's the western portion of the state. We have plenty of plants that came out of northern Mexico. A lot of those were donated to us as plants, and so we're growing those out, and we're slowly trying to get some of these plants sort of into our collections. Many of these plants, as we're looking for places, we want to make sure that in 20 years they're not going to be in the way of something else. And we're currently we're going through another master plan. So many of these will probably wait till that master plan is done before we begin planting some of these guys. So where do we get all these guys? Well, it all started a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, when oaks were not even on my radar. And I got involved with the GCCO and the International Oak Society. We got a lot of acorns from the acorn swap. I actually purchased a few through the auction. The vast majority of them came through various networks, and John Ferry Garden supplied us with probably 30 of those species that you saw earlier. The GCCO work that we do, we get donations from other places that I would never be able to make it to. Mercer yesterday just passed along some Quercus arkansana Sol Ross, who's also a member of that GCCO network. We've been receiving plants from them. Various private collectors throughout the past year have reached out to us, and they said they have some plants they'd like to send us, or acorns they'd like to send us. And of course, there's the occasional nursery out there that are still wild collecting. At this point, I only know about 4 of them. Not all of them are doing oaks, but occasionally we can get some good oak species through there. And of course, the field work that we do. Granted, most of that is sort of just here in Texas, but through here in Texas, we've been able to grow basically all the Central Texas species that we've been collecting over the past couple of years. And we have dozens, if not hundreds, on some of those that we'll share with other gardens whenever they ask or whatever they need. But again, most of our field work is just here in Central, South, and West Texas. The propagation, most of those are just direct acorns, and we're just growing as much as we can. Some we're doing root cuttings. We just started this year growing our Hinkley's from the root cuttings. We're trying to do sort of duplicates of 10 at a time for each tree as we go through, and then grafting. Now, we're not set up to do grafting, no experience doing grafting, so that grafting is coming from other people like Ryan Russell that Amy had mentioned earlier. There's Robinson Sudan, who's up at Texas State, and of course, Philip Schultz. We were just on a trip out in West Texas a week and a half ago to collect some oddball red oaks from some private land out there. So some tardifolia-ish plants and some other strange things I'd never seen before in my life. And I'll just show you this photo. I came across this the other day. So if you haven't heard, be careful with your acorns. I'll leave that there for a second, and then be happy to answer questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Michael. So does anyone have any questions? You can unmute or put it in the chat.
I have a question. Michael, thanks for a great presentation. Fantastic. Do you have a collection policy with your oaks? I see most of them seem to be like Texan oaks but there's also like a couple of European in there and some Mexican ones. Are you going to expand that, or are you going to keep focusing on Texan oaks?
So yes, what we're focusing on are currently essentially Western Texas, Southwest US, and northern Mexico. And part of that, and I'll be honest, we were not planning this. It kind of just happened, and a lot of that just came from a very generous donation from John Ferry Garden and their connections where they had been receiving plants or acorns and growing them out. And once we started looking through everything that we had, we realized like, wow, we have a fairly substantial Texas collection, Western Texas, and then including that Southwest. So if you look throughout the Southwest, excluding California, I think there's just 2 species that were missing, and it definitely was not planned. This was, again, just receiving some donations from them. We are currently working on our collections policy as far as like what we're gearing towards. We had originally looked at the Woody Fabiaceae as one of our APGA collections, but now we're looking at and also adding on an oak collection to that as well, and having these sort of southwestern, including Texas, southwestern oaks and northern Mexico. We're trying to include those.
Thank you.
Sure.
Great. Other questions?
No. Philip?
I want to know what the deal is with the crickets.
Oh, crickets. We have no, when you ask about the oaks of a certain area, or someone asks you a question and they don't know the answer,
Oh,
Yeah.
silence. Okay.
Silence. Yeah.
That on top of the fact that, I mean, our grow area is just swarming with the things. You can't lift a pot without seeing 18 crickets.
That's what I thought you meant.
No.
Okay.
No, we don't have any. And it's, you look through areas and you wonder, like, why isn't there a South Texas, the oaks from deep South Texas? Why are they not included? That's a very important component of certain areas of South Texas. And in one area, that's where the Tillandsia baileyii occurs. It's a rare plant that only occurs in ebony, and there's another population in some live oaks there south of Kingsville. And it seems like that would have been something to actively go after. But as I tell Zachary, and if you don't know, Zachary works with me, it's like, the good thing is we have so much to do, and we are in a position of being able to add an immense amount of diversity, not just oaks, but everything else to our garden. So pretty exciting. But yeah, I will say that I was very surprised to hear that they did not have a list of species for the garden when I first started working there about 7 years ago. So I think a lot of that science and conservation, even though that they had a conservation person, it just wasn't there. And I think slowly what had probably happened over time is you have institutional knowledge and people leave, and that work wasn't followed through. And it's much easier to not do something than to do something. And I think that as that person who was doing all that work left, and then the new person comes in, and wasn't, there could have been a 1 or 2 year gap, and then that it just wasn't on their radar to keep doing something because no one told them that they needed to. Philip?
Oh, awesome presentation. I've been there a lot. I had no idea that you had so many species from the earlier days. So I think I'm gonna have to come down there pretty soon and see them all in person. And I really liked I saw that it looked like you were taking the time to print real tags with all the information for the stuff when it was even in the nursery. And I thought that was a good way to do it.
Yeah. And part of that is because we do work with a lot of volunteers. And we have a good crew of about 12 volunteers that work with nothing but the rare and endangered conservation plants. And since we are getting collections from, let's say, the Lacey oaks, for instance, that came from 2 different locations, and just to make sure that those don't get mixed up, and those tags have to follow, from the tree pots up to the 5 gallons, et cetera, et cetera. That said, we could be doing a better job.
Well, it's just so time consuming, and to tag things in the acorn stage, even when a lot of them don't grow, it's a real commitment.
Right. Well, and some of those, so we're learnings, like now what we're doing is when we grow them in mass in a common pot, we'll print out 20 labels, and once we pot them up, then we'll put those in there. In some cases, those containers, a lot of those already had radicals coming out, so we had gone ahead and put those tags in, but because of a variety of reasons, some of those just died out, and so some of those containers don't have live plants anymore. But we slowly go through and weed some of those out as we can. But yeah. Yeah, and I think Jenna just mentioned something, and we have one of these little thermal printers, and that's what we use, and they're fairly cheap and expensive. I think we paid $200 for them, and then we get 2,500 labels for a couple $100, maybe $100. Can't remember what it is. It's quite handy to have.
Great, thanks for those questions and comments. Yeah, I was just about to say there's a lot of great comments in the chat. Other questions for Michael? All right. Well, Roger, do you have anything else you want to add or?
Yeah, just as sort of closing remarks, these webinars are actually the largest meeting of IOS members between conference years. So it's great to see everyone here, and thank you for joining in. Usually at the end, we open this up to, anyone have any comment about the society or events or suggestions, what we could be doing, please speak up now. And while you're thinking about that, I'd like to thank our presenters. These were great presentations. Thank you, Kate, Karina, and Amy, for all that fascinating information on GCCO. I'm really looking forward to seeing those analyses coming out. And it's great. I think it's a great opportunity for the IOS to be more involved with that, because some exciting work coming up there. And thanks, Michael, for that visit to San Antonio Botanical Garden. I mean, I was there the Texas Open days, so it was great to revisit and to learn a whole lot more of the history and the background. So yeah, anyone have anything to comment on this event or other IOS business before we close this up? Please put it in the chat or speak up.
I'd just like to say the Morton presentation was really, really cool. I really enjoyed that. It was very comprehensive. There was a lot of data. I like it was science-based. That was some really interesting work. And it's really cool to see that you guys are doing such specific projects with oak species in general. And I know it's difficult to focus on certain taxa to conserve, but I definitely like the approach that you took. And I like that it's very focused and, one genera, and you can really, build a collection, and you have a good, good way to get that source material. There are a lot of institutions, obviously, here in the US who are working with Quercus. So anyway, that was really awesome. Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Zach. Really appreciate that.
Okay, well, I think it looks like we can close it here. Next webinar will be in sort of late May, and we'll be announcing the details of that. So I hope you can all join us then. And back to you, Amy, to close it up. Thank you.
Yeah, no, just a huge thanks again to our presenters and for everyone joining us today. Really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye all.